Greetings. My name is Randy Roberts. I am privileged to serve as senior pastor of the Loma Linda University Church in Loma Linda, California. The title of this sermon is The Caring and the Carried. I was just shortly out of seminary when I encountered the young man in a small chapel where I was pastoring. He and I sat on the front row of the chapel, and he wept out his pain. You see, his father had followed his mother home from work, and with the gun in his hand had ended her life. Then he had turned the gun on himself and ended his own life. And now Mark sat in this chapel beside me as a young pastor, weeping out his pain. My books and my studies hadn't prepared me for this raw emotion. I wasn't sure what to say to him. I knew what I wanted to say. What I wanted to say to him was, Jesus can heal your pain. But I was afraid he might ask me, how? How can Jesus heal my pain? Just a few months and a few miles removed from that place, I sat in a living room with a husband and wife. It was the middle of the night. They had called rather desperate, saying things were out of control. I went and sat with them a couple of hours that night. There were raised voices and raised tempers, shattered glass, frightened children. I really wasn't sure what to say to them. Or maybe I should say I knew what I wanted to say, but I was a bit afraid. I wanted to say to them, Jesus can heal your pain. But I was a bit afraid that they might ask me, how? How can Jesus heal our pain? It may be that you find yourself in that position today. You have a pain in your heart, a woundedness in your soul. Christian friends have told you Jesus can heal that pain, but you have that one word query, how? There's a man in the Bible that might help us answer that question. His story is found in the Gospel of Mark. Mark's Gospel, the 2nd chapter. It is here in this story that this man tells us that there may be two ways in which Jesus can heal your pain. The first way in which I believe Jesus used to heal this man's pain was friendship. Maybe Jesus can heal your pain through friendship. Listen to the words Mark records. Mark chapter 2 and verse 1. A few days later, when Jesus again entered Capernaum, the people heard that he had come home. So many gathered that there was no room left, not even outside the door. And he preached the word to them. Some men came, bringing to him a paralytic carried by 4 of them. Since they could not get him to Jesus because of the crowd, they made an opening in the roof above Jesus, and after digging through it, lowered the mat the paralyzed man was lying on. Can you see him in your mind's eye? Can you see the gathered crowd as they stagger back and gaze upward at the dirt falling on their heads? Can you see this man descend on the mat? He must have had quite a story to tell. We are not told what led to his paralysis. We're not told his background. In fact, we're not told what I'm almost certain must have occurred. He must have been there, cast upon his mat, when the stories began to circulate. The stories of this teacher, this rabbi from Galilee who healed. As he listened to those stories, he must have realized that that man probably was his greatest hope. If he could only get to this man named Jesus, dared he to hope? Could it be true? Would probably become reality? But can you see him again? as he lies there and gazes down at the legs that will not respond. If getting to Jesus was his greatest hope, how to get there was his greatest problem. Left to himself, he would not get to the place of healing. May I share with you the words of a chaplain named Larry Yeagley. First, a brief quote, and then a story. Yeagley writes, "When a grieving person feels cut off from God, the gap is often bridged by a person who is not afraid to enter their pain. I would call that person a friend." And then Yeagley pens these words, "I spoke to a group of people who had cancer. A man in his 50s shared his story with the group. I'll call him Mr. Howell. Mr. Howell's doctor came into the hospital room and announced that the diagnosis of cancer was clearly confirmed. The disease had metastasized to many parts of the body. The prognosis was very poor. Mr. Howell was so angry inside that he could barely contain himself. He was angry at God. He felt abandoned by God and wanted nothing more to do with him. When his family left that evening, he turned out the light, turned his face toward the wall, and wept out his anger. At that point," says Yeagley, "a nurse came to the doorway of his room. 'Mr. Howell, are you all right?' she asked. 'Yes,' he answered sharply. 'Are you crying?' 'No,' he yelled angrily. Now that nurse could have turned on her heels and left Mr. Howell to suffer alone, but she didn't. She came into his room and sat down at the head of his bed. She held Mr. Howell's hand and stroked his hair. 'It's okay to cry, Mr. Howell, when you think you are going to die before you thought. We nurses cry too when our patients aren't doing well. It's okay to be angry. We nurses are angry too when our patients are dying. If you want me to, I'll stay right here and I'll listen as long as you need to talk.' Then Mr. Howell made a profound statement to that group. I knew that the lady in a white uniform was a nurse, but she wasn't really a nurse. God was sitting by my bed. He was assuring me that even though I felt forsaken and lonely, He was still with me." Jesus can heal your pain through friendship. And it was through 4 friends who cared enough to enter into his life and pick him up that the paralytic was carried to the place where Jesus could heal his pain. It may be that God will heal your pain through friendship. But there's a second way, back to Mark's gospel, back to Mark, the 2nd chapter. There's a second way that Jesus used to heal this man's pain. Mark, the 2nd chapter, tells us simply this, beginning in verse 5. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now, some teachers of the law were sitting there thinking to themselves, "Why does this man talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Immediately, Jesus knew in his spirit that this was what they were thinking in their hearts, and he said to them, "Why are you saying in your hearts these things? Which is easier, to say to the paralytic, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Get up and walk'? But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins," he said to the paralytic, "I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home." He got up, took his mat, and walked out in full view of them all. This amazed everyone, and they praised God, saying, "We have never seen anything like this." You can see him suspended in the air when Jesus looks at him and says, "Son, God is not angry with you. Your sins are forgiven." When Jesus uttered those words, problems loomed on the horizon. We know from the theology held at that day and time that that was problematic. They believed in that era that if someone suffered, it was because somewhere in their past they had sinned. They were now being punished. They added to that this. They said, therefore, if someone is to be healed of his suffering, his sins must first be forgiven. And now Jesus looks at this man and says, son, your sins are forgiven. And their brows furrow and their faces fall and their hearts are angry. How can you do that? How can you claim to forgive? And Jesus asks them the question, which is easier, to claim to forgive or to claim to heal? It would seem to me that the answer would be, it's easier to claim to forgive, for there's no immediate proof or disproof. But if you claim to heal, you better be ready to produce. Is that really the answer, though? You see, for Jesus to heal sick bodies cost him nothing. For him to come and deliver a message of forgiveness cost him everything. It meant there would be an empty throne and a full manger. It meant there would be blood-stained steps on the way to Calvary. It meant a cross. It meant sacrificing himself to say, your sins are forgiven. But to the people that day, they were waiting. Can he indeed forgive? Because of their theology. Remember, they said there is no sick man healed of his sickness until his sins have been forgiven. So you understand what Jesus is saying to them. He is saying, in essence, if I heal this man, that will be evidence based on your own theology that his sins have been forgiven. And then he turns to the man and he says, I say to you, arise. It's easy to read that and to miss the words that have just been uttered. We suppose that Jesus said, but so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to heal sick bodies. No. Jesus says, but so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, I say, arise. And he obeyed. He stood up, and the crowd that moments before would not part now parted like the Red Sea as he walked out. Isn't it interesting that the power to walk was the proof of forgiveness? Jesus watches the man leave. His pain has been healed in two ways. Jesus has healed his pain through friendship. Jesus has healed his pain through forgiveness. In the same way, Jesus will work today in your heart, in your world, in your life. So I no longer feel hesitant in fear of the question, how? Rather, to you who suffer, to you who are sin-burdened, who are soul weary, I say, Jesus can heal your pain.